Hello, and welcome to the 5th Ghost Light tour of the Smith Opera House in Geneva, New York. Since you can't come to the Smith right now for our history tours, we'll bring the history to you. I'm Chris Woodworth, and I'll be your tour guide. I want to take a moment to thank Gretty Hollister and Jennings, who contributed a portion of the research for this week's episode. So, without further ado, here's Episode 5, Opening Night. A garret. Window with climbing plants. Dantes discovered seated. La Carconte standing. La Carconte speaks first. "You seem very melancholy today, Father Dantes." Dantes replies, "I grow so impatient for my son's return. He has been so long absent." With those words, on October 29, 1894, the Smith Opera House opened for business. The opening performance was the play Monte Cristo, starring the legendary actor James O'Neill. Unless you are a theater history buff, you may not know who James O'Neill was. It's more likely that you have heard of his son, the playwright Eugene O'Neill. By the time James opened Monte Cristo at the Smith in 1894, he had reportedly performed the piece over 3,000 times. Before his death in 1920, O'Neill appeared in Monte Cristo over 6,000 times. The play was adapted from the novel The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. O'Neill first appeared in the role in 1883 in New York City. The script was originally adapted by an actor-manager named Charles Fector. Over the many years that O'Neill appeared as Dantes, he tweaked and revised the script. Several different versions were preserved, so it's hard to know which specific adaptation Geneva audiences witnessed that night. Whichever one it was, the audience was delighted. The October 23, 1894 issue of the Geneva Advertiser detailed some of the remaining construction that still needed to happen in time for opening night 6 days later. It was quite a long list that included placing the pipes from the recently installed boilers, laying the carpet, hanging of the draperies and curtains, and, of course, one giant cleaning. It seemed that it was much too long of a list, as the paper reported, "We stepped into the new Opera House Saturday at noon to ascertain how the men were getting along with the interior. We saw enough to convince us that it will not be declared finished by the opening night." Indeed, there were several elements that were still incomplete by opening. When the audience arrived on opening night, they had to wait outside listening to hammering for almost 15 minutes. The Advertiser did note that the chairs are wide and their seating is very comfortable. So who was sitting in those seats? In early October 1894, Smith manager F.K. Hardison announced a unique auction for seats. Patrons could purchase seats in the orchestra circle section of the theater for $1.50, approximately $45 today. But that purchase was not tied to a specific seat, according to the October 9th issue of the Geneva Advertiser. Instead, parties who buy seats will then bid for first choice, and the highest bidder will take the choice of what seats he requires at the figure he offers. Those familiar with street names in Geneva will recognize the name of the top bidder who won his choice of 10 seats in row A of the balcony circle, Mr. J. Lawrence Slauson. The October 23, 1894 issue of the Geneva Advertiser listed all of the auction winners and their choice of seats. William Smith had done his best to remain humble that night by quietly taking an unremarkable seat in the audience during the overture, but was met with an ovation of hand-clapping that fairly drowned the music of the orchestra, according to the November 2nd issue of the Geneva Gazette. After the second of the 5 acts of Monte Cristo had finished, a Mr. S.F. Gascoigne stepped on stage from his box in order to praise Smith for the gift he had given Geneva. He likened the opening of the Opera House to awakening from a horrible nightmare into the visions of a beautiful dream. He then asked the audience to demonstrate their gratitude by a show of palms, and a sea of uplifted hands responded. And how did Smith receive these thanks? The next day, the Geneva Advertiser speculated, "We all know he is not a man of words. One cannot imagine how he feels by the expression of his face, but we'll wager there was a glad throbbing behind his vest, a little quicker pulsation all through his system at this spontaneous, though silent expression from his more than 1,000 friends and neighbors. Opening night was completely sold out. Each of the 1,200 seats was filled, and there was a standing room only section for latecomers. A review in the Geneva Advertiser reported, Mr. O'Neill's company was at its best, and they gave a vivid version of that highly dramatic play. While the Geneva Gazette described Monte Cristo as a thrilling and engrossing production, commanding the closest attention from rise to fall of curtain. And what was Mr. James O'Neill's review of the brand new Smith? According to the Geneva Gazette, he deemed it not inferior. Luckily, the paper had a slightly more enthusiastic take, declaring, "It was a most auspicious opening of Geneva's new playhouse, the forerunner, let us hope, of many equally good entertainments." For more information on the history of the Smith Opera House, please visit our history blog, which can be found on our website, thesmith.org. You can also learn how to become a member of the Smith and how to make a donation. We'll see you next time for another ghost-like glimpse of the history of the Smith.